The Andes Mountains. Towering peaks pierce the clouds. Deep valleys disappear into shadow. The air is thin and cold. The silence is broken only by the wind. It whispers through the canyons. It carries secrets, dark secrets. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, a chill settled over the Andes. It was not the natural chill of the mountains. It was a chill of fear, stories of missing girls, screams for justice. The Andes region is a tapestry of cultures and communities. Indigenous peoples have lived there for centuries. Their lives are intertwined with the land, but the Andes are also a place of isolation. Villages are scattered across vast distances. This isolation bred a sense of vulnerability. A shadow fell across the Andes, a shadow of evil. It preyed on the innocent. His family was large, resources were scarce, hunger was a constant companion, love even more so. His mother, overwhelmed by circumstance, was ill-equipped to provide the care a child needs. She was a woman broken by life. Her spirit, like their dwelling, was crumbling. Scars of abandonment. His mother, unable to cope, made a heart-wrenching decision. She left. She abandoned him and his siblings. Whether she intended to return, we may never know. He was just a boy, alone in a world that had shown him little kindness. The streets, once his playground, became his battleground. He fought for scraps of food. He slept wherever he could find shelter. He learned to trust no one. The streets were a cruel teacher. Violence begets violence. He found solace in the company of other lost souls, children who had also been abandoned by society. They formed a pack, a brotherhood of the forgotten. They relied on each other for survival, but their survival often came at a cost. They stole to eat, they fought for territory. Violence became a way of life, a means of communication, a way to assert dominance. He excelled in this brutal environment. The making of a monster. He emerged from the detention center a hardened criminal, a predator in the making. He had learned that the world was a cruel and unforgiving place, and he was determined to make it pay. He drifted from town to town, committing petty crimes, always on the run. He moved through the Andean villages like a phantom, a whisper in the wind. He studied his prey, learning their routines, identifying their vulnerabilities.
I was a hunter, and I was stalking my prey.
He chose his victims carefully, young girls often alone, living on the fringes of society. He saw their desperation, their hunger. He spun tales of opportunity, of a better life. He spoke of jobs in the city, of kind families willing to take them in. He painted a picture of a future free from poverty and despair.
I knew how to exploit their innocence, their naivety.
He preyed on their desire for a better life. He would lead them deep into the mountains, away from civilization, away from prying eyes. He knew these mountains like the back of his hand. He knew every hidden path, every secluded valley, every place where a scream could go unheard.
Their trust, so carefully cultivated, became their prison. They were trapped, alone, at my mercy, and I was a merciless god.
The transformation was swift and brutal. The kindness vanished. The ritual of horror, the act of murder, was never enough.
I craved more. I needed to possess them completely, even in death.
He developed a gruesome ritual, a way to relive his crimes, to savor his power over his victims. He would bury his victims in shallow graves, often near watering holes. He believed the water would cleanse their souls and his own. Colombia, the hunting ground. Colombia, a land of contrasts, vibrant cities, lush rainforests, and the towering Andes Mountains. It was here in the remote villages nestled among the peaks that his reign of terror began. He moved like a ghost, unseen, unheard, preying on the most vulnerable.
My victims were often young girls from impoverished families.
Ecuador, a trail of tears. As the body count rose in Colombia, so too did suspicion. Whispers of a monster preying on young girls spread through the villages. The authorities began to investigate, but he was always one step ahead. He seemed to vanish into thin air.
I crossed the border into Ecuador, a country grappling with its own social and economic challenges. A country where law enforcement was often stretched thin. A country ripe for exploitation.
He blended in seamlessly, adopting a new identity. Peru, the shadow lengthens, the hunt for the monster intensified. Law enforcement agencies from Colombia and Ecuador joined forces. They shared information. They pooled their resources. They were determined to bring him to justice. But he was always one step ahead. He slipped across the border into Peru, another country with vast remote regions, another country with a history of social and economic inequality, another country where I could disappear. His modus operandi remained the same. He preyed on the vulnerable. A region in fear. The Andes region was in the grip of terror. Parents were afraid to let their children out of their sight. Young girls were warned about talking to strangers. The once peaceful mountains had become a hunting ground, and no one felt safe. The monster had cast a long shadow over the Andes. He had exposed the vulnerabilities of the region, the poverty. The floods of revelation. The rainy season in the Andes can be brutal. Torrents of water cascade down the mountains, transforming placid streams into raging rivers. The land, parched for months, drinks deeply, but this thirst can be destructive. The earth, saturated and heavy, surrenders its secrets. In 1980, near the town of Ambato in Ecuador, the earth yielded a horrifying truth. A gruesome jigsaw puzzle. The task of identifying the victims and piecing together the evidence was daunting. The floods had scattered the remains, making it difficult to determine how many bodies there were, let alone who they were. The tropical climate had accelerated decomposition, erasing potential clues. Teams of forensic anthropologists, archaeologists, and detectives descended upon Ambato. They worked tirelessly, meticulously sifting through the mud and debris. Every bone, every piece of clothing, every strand of hair was treated as a vital piece of a gruesome jigsaw puzzle. As the bodies were exhumed, a horrifying pattern emerged. The victims were all young girls. Many showed signs of torture. The cause of death was often strangulation. The details matched the rumors that had circulated for years, the rumors of a monster who preyed on the innocent. The investigation took on a new urgency. The authorities knew they were dealing with a serial killer of unprecedented depravity. They also knew that he was still out there, somewhere, and he was likely planning his next move. The walls close in. The discovery of the mass grave in Ambato sent shockwaves through the Andes region. The public was outraged. They demanded justice for the victims. They demanded that the monster be caught. The pressure on the authorities was immense. Slowly but surely, the walls began to close in. A pattern emerged. Witnesses described a charismatic stranger, a man who preyed on the vulnerable, a man who offered kindness and then took everything. A composite sketch was created, and a name surfaced. The authorities finally had a suspect, a name to put to the monster who had haunted their dreams for years. But finding him would be the easy part. Bringing him to justice would prove to be a far greater challenge. Investigators reviewing files and evidence in a dimly lit room, footage of a suspect being interrogated. The investigation expanded. Law enforcement agencies across Colombia, Ecuador, and Peru shared information and resources. They interviewed witnesses, they tracked down leads. They followed every whisper, every rumor, every shred of evidence. A monster unmasked, the manhunt intensified. The suspect's face was plastered on wanted posters across the region. His name was whispered in hushed tones. The media dubbed him the Monster of the Andes, a fitting moniker for a man accused of such unspeakable crimes. In the spring of 1980, acting on a tip, police in Ecuador closed in on the suspect. He was apprehended in a crowded marketplace, attempting to lure a young girl away from her mother. He offered no resistance. It was as if he had been expecting them. The arrest sent a collective sigh of relief through the Andes region. The monster had been caught. But the sense of relief was soon replaced by a chilling realization. The man in custody was not some shadowy, mythical figure. He was real, and the horrors he had inflicted were all too real. The trial of the Monster of the Andes was, well, a media spectacle. Journalists from around the world descended upon the small Ecuadorian town where the proceedings were held. The courtroom was packed with families of the victims, their faces etched with grief and anger. The prosecution presented a mountain of evidence. Forensic reports detailed the horrific injuries inflicted upon the victims. Witnesses testified to the suspect's predatory behavior and his modus operandi of luring young girls away from their families. The prosecution painted a picture of a cold, calculating killer, a man devoid of empathy or remorse. The defense, hampered by the overwhelming evidence and the public outcry, struggled to mount a credible case. They argued that the suspect was mentally unstable, incapable of understanding the gravity of his actions. They pointed to his traumatic childhood, his history of abuse and neglect as mitigating factors. The courtroom became a battleground of emotions. Families of the victims wept openly as the prosecution presented its case. The suspect, meanwhile, remained impassive, his eyes betraying no emotion. He seemed detached from the proceedings, as if he were an observer rather than the accused. As the trial progressed, the prosecution played its trump card, a confession. The suspect, in chilling detail, confessed to the murders of over 100 young girls. He described how he would gain their trust, lure them to secluded areas, and then torture and kill them. He spoke of his crimes without a hint of remorse, his voice flat and emotionless. The confession sent shockwaves through the courtroom. Even the most seasoned investigators were stunned by the suspect's matter-of-fact recounting of his crimes. He seemed to relish in the details, describing how he would savor the fear and pain of his victims. The defense argued that the confession was coerced, that the suspect was pressured into admitting to crimes he did not commit. However, the prosecution presented evidence that the confession was given freely and voluntarily. The suspect, they argued, was eager to boast of his crimes, to revel in the notoriety. The confession sealed the suspect's fate. The jury, faced with overwhelming evidence and a confession that chilled them to their core, returned a guilty verdict on all counts. The Monster of the Andes had been convicted, but the story was far from over. The trial centered around the suspect's sanity. The prosecution argued he was fully aware of his actions. They demanded life in prison without parole. The defense presented a different picture. Experts testified he suffered from a severe personality disorder. The judge opted for a compromise. He was sentenced to prison with the possibility of parole.
The Monster of the Andes was incarcerated, but the Andes region was far from safe.
The trial had exposed deep-seated fears and vulnerabilities. The families of the victims were left to grapple with their loss, their pain compounded by a justice system that seemed to have failed them. Rumors persisted that the suspect had not acted alone, that others had been involved in his crimes. These rumors, fueled by fear and suspicion, spread like wildfire through the Andes region. Villages once considered safe were now shrouded in paranoia. The authorities, eager to quell the unrest, launched investigations into the suspects' past. They followed up on every lead, every whisper, every shred of evidence that might lead them to accomplices. But the trail was cold. The monster of the Andes had taken his secrets to prison with him. The scars of the monster's crimes ran deep, a reminder of the darkness that could lurk even in the most beautiful of landscapes. The families of the victims, united by grief and a thirst for justice, vowed to keep their memories alive, to ensure that their daughters, their sisters, their friends would never be forgotten. The monster of the Andes was imprisoned, his reign of terror brought to an end. Yet the Andes could not shake the chill that had settled deep within its heart. The trial closed one chapter but opened another, filled with unanswered questions and dread. The families of the victims found little solace in the verdict. Their grief was a wound that refused to heal. The monster's shadow stretched far beyond the courtroom walls. Fear had taken root, transforming the way people lived and interacted. The monster of the Andes was incarcerated, but rumors of his crimes continued to circulate, whispered in hushed tones, passed from village to village, carried on the wind that swept across the mountains. Some whispers spoke of accomplices, shadowy figures who had aided the monster in his reign of terror, their identities shrouded in mystery, their motives unknown. These whispers, fueled by fear and uncertainty, sowed seeds of doubt and mistrust. Neighbors looked at each other with suspicion, questioning long-held assumptions about those they thought they knew. The monster's legacy, it seemed, was not just one of death and destruction, but of a corrosive paranoia that threatened to unravel the social fabric of the Andes. The monster of the Andes was sentenced to a lengthy prison term. His freedom curtailed, his movements restricted to the confines of a cold, concrete cell. Yet, for the families of the victims, true justice remained elusive, a distant horizon they could never quite reach. The legal system offered retribution, but it could not erase their pain, nor bring back their loved ones. The monster's sentence, they argued, paled in comparison to the enormity of his crimes. How could a number ever compensate for the futures stolen, the dreams shattered, the families torn apart? The possibility of parole loomed over them like a dark cloud, a reminder that he might one day walk free. They vowed to fight any attempt at his release, to ensure he would remain behind bars, haunted by his crimes. The monster of the Andes may have been imprisoned, but his legacy lived on, a chilling reminder of the darkness that can lurk beneath humanity. He cast a long shadow over the Andes, transforming innocence into suspicion, trust into fear. Parents, once content, now kept their children close, aware of the lurking evil. The mountains, once a source of wonder, now held a sinister allure, tainted by his crimes. His legacy serves as a cautionary tale, reminding us that predators often lurk in plain sight. His crimes sparked a global conversation about evil, the need for justice, and protecting the vulnerable. The fear he instilled and the scars he left will haunt the Andes for generations. The question remains, who is this all about?